I see them, and they see me. Every single Mass, they surround me, pressing against me, screaming into my ears with voices that would drive an ordinary man to madness. These words, recorded in the testimonies of St. John Vianney by his confessors and documented in the ecclesiastical investigation that preceded his canonization, describe something so terrifying, so overwhelming in its spiritual intensity, that those who heard him speak of it could barely comprehend how a human being could endure such an assault and continue to celebrate Mass with dignity and reverence. The vision that haunted John Vianney throughout his entire priesthood, the constant, unrelenting presence of demonic forces surrounding him at the altar, was not a temporary trial or a passing spiritual attack. It was the defining characteristic of his priestly ministry, a revelation of supernatural reality so profound and so horrifying that it would shape everything he understood about the nature of the Mass, the power of the priesthood, and the cosmic battle between good and evil that rages invisibly around every altar in the world. Jean-Baptiste Marie Vianney was born in 1886 in the small village of Dardilly, France, during a time of tremendous upheaval in the French Church. The French Revolution had devastated Catholic institutions, seminaries had been closed, priests had been executed or forced into hiding, and the faith itself seemed to be dying in the hearts of the French people. Into this darkness, John Vianney was called to priesthood. He was ordained in 1914, at an age when most men would be thinking of retirement. After years of struggles in seminary, he was not naturally gifted as a scholar, he struggled with languages, and many of his teachers doubted whether he possessed the intellectual capacity for priesthood. Yet his bishop, recognizing in him a profound holiness and a burning desire to serve souls, ordained him anyway. John Vianney's first assignment was to the small village of Ars, a place so spiritually desolate, so morally corrupt, that the previous priest had abandoned it in despair. The village was known for drunkenness, sexual immorality, profaning of the Sabbath, and near total indifference to the faith. When John Vianney arrived, the church was nearly empty. People lived as if God did not exist. And it was in this context of spiritual darkness that John Vianney began to experience the visions that would define his priesthood. Almost immediately upon his arrival in Ars, he began to perceive, with overwhelming clarity, the presence of demonic forces in the village and particularly around the altar where he celebrated Mass. In the earliest accounts, preserved in the testimonies of those who knew him, John Vianney described seeing dark shapes moving around the chapel during Massachusetts. He would be celebrating, speaking the words of consecration, and he would perceive with his spiritual senses the presence of entities that did not belong to the natural world. His spiritual director, Father Bally, documented that John Vianney reported seeing these demonic presences with such consistency and such specific detail that it became clear this was not imagination or psychological disturbance but genuine mystical perception. He described them not as abstract evil forces but as concrete, specific entities with forms and movements, demons pressing against him, trying to distract him, attempting to disrupt the sacred action occurring at the altar. The horror of these visions lay not merely in their supernatural character but in their relentlessness. John Vianney could not escape them. When he was not celebrating Mass, he perceived them in his room, in the confessional, in the village itself. But their assault was most intense, most concentrated, most overwhelming during the celebration of the Eucharist. He wrote to his spiritual director, "During Mass, I feel their presence as a physical weight upon my shoulders. They press against me from all sides. I hear their screaming, their rage, their desperate attempts to distract me from the holy sacrifice I am performing. It is as if all the demons of hell have gathered around this one small altar to prevent me from offering the Mass with the reverence it demands." What made John Vianney's vision particularly significant was not merely that he perceived demonic presence but that he understood what it meant. Through his mystical perception, he came to comprehend that the demons gathered around the altar because they understood the absolute power of the Eucharist, the absolute centrality of the Mass to the Church's existence, and to the salvation of souls. The demons knew that every Mass celebrated was a victory for Christ, that every soul transformed through the sacraments was a soul eternally lost to their dominion. And so they gathered with desperate fury, not to prevent the Mass from occurring, they could not do that, but to distract the priest, to weaken the reverence with which it was celebrated, to reduce its fruitfulness in the souls of the faithful. In one documented account, John Vianney described a vision so intense that he could barely speak of it even to his confessor. He was at the altar, in the moment approaching the consecration, and suddenly the supernatural veil seemed to lift, and he perceived with absolute clarity the demonic forces assembled around him. He described them as being so numerous that they seemed to fill the entire chapel, crowding against each other in their desperation and rage. Some took forms vaguely humanoid but twisted and grotesque. Others appeared as pure manifestations of malice and darkness without fixed form. And all of them were directed toward one purpose: to assault, to distract, to disturb the priest who dared to approach the altar of God. Yet what John Vianney perceived in that same vision was something equally significant. He saw that between him and the demonic forces stood a barrier of light, the protection of the Virgin Mary, the intercession of the saints, the power of Christ himself. The demons could not touch him. They could not prevent the Mass from occurring. They could not diminish the power of the sacrament being celebrated. All they could do was assault his mind, his emotions, his senses. They could attack him spiritually but not physically destroy the sacred action. And in understanding this, John Vianney grasped something fundamental about the nature of spiritual warfare, that the battle raging around every altar is terrifyingly real, but that Christ's victory is absolutely certain, that the demons rage because they have already been defeated. The physical manifestations of John Vianney's perception of these demonic presences were extraordinary. Those who knew him reported that during Mass, he would sometimes pause, as if listening to something, his face growing pale, his hands trembling. He would grip the altar for support, his knuckles turning white from the intensity of his grip. After some Masses, he would emerge from the sanctuary completely exhausted, as if he had endured a physical battle. His housekeeper reported that she would sometimes find him in his room after Mass, lying on his bed unable to move, his entire body shaking from the intensity of what he had experienced in the spiritual realm. Yet despite these overwhelming attacks, despite the constant assault of demonic presence, John Vianney never allowed the visions to deter him from his priesthood. On the contrary, they deepened his commitment to celebrating Mass with maximum reverence and care. He began to spend extraordinary lengths of time preparing for Mass, hours in prayer and fasting before celebrating. He would enter the confessional immediately after Mass and spend entire days hearing the confessions of the faithful. And through his visions of the demonic reality surrounding the altar, he came to understand with absolute clarity what the priesthood truly is: not a position of honor or privilege, but a participation in Christ's eternal battle against evil, a standing at the front line of cosmic warfare between light and darkness. One of the most profound aspects of John Vianney's mystical understanding of the demonic presence at the altar was his perception of the connection between the sins of the faithful and the intensity of the demonic assault. He came to understand, through his visions, that the demons gathered most desperately around those Masses where the faith was weakest, where people approached with indifference, or without genuine repentance. Conversely, when the faithful approached with genuine faith, with sincere sorrow for their sins, with open hearts to receive grace, the demonic presence seemed less intense, less successful in its attempts to disrupt the sacred action. This understanding motivated John Vianney to engage in an extraordinary apostolate of prayer and penance. He began to offer his own suffering, the suffering caused by perceiving the demonic assault during every Mass, as a kind of intercessory offering on behalf of the souls in his parish. He would say to his spiritual director, "If my perception of these demons, if my suffering at their presence, can obtain grace for even one soul to repent and return to God, then it is worth enduring. For what is my comfort or peace compared to the salvation of a single soul?" The vision that perhaps most profoundly affected John Vianney came when he perceived not only the demonic presence surrounding him at the altar but also the spiritual reality of what was occurring in the hearts of those receiving communion. He described a vision in which he was distributing Holy Communion, and suddenly he perceived with his mystical sight the condition of each soul receiving the sacrament. Some souls appeared luminous, transformed by grace, receiving Christ with genuine faith and opening themselves to his transforming power. But others appeared darkened, spiritually sick, approaching the altar while carrying unrepented mortal sin within them. And for those souls receiving unworthily, John Vianney perceived that the demonic forces intensified their assault, not on the priest but on the souls themselves, attempting to prevent them from being transformed by grace, attempting to harden them further in their resistance to God. The weight of perceiving this reality nearly broke John Vianney. He understood that he was standing at a crossroads of salvation and damnation, that every Mass he celebrated was determining, or at least significantly affecting, the eternal fate of the souls he served. The demonic presence at the altar was not merely a personal trial but a window into the cosmic significance of the priesthood, a revelation of what is truly at stake in every celebration of the Eucharist. He began to spend entire nights in prayer, interceding for the souls of his parish, offering his own suffering as a kind of substitute for the sorrow many of them failed to offer for their sins. In documented accounts from those who lived through this period, John Vianney's struggle against the demonic presence at the altar became increasingly visible to others. People reported seeing him struggle visibly during Mass, seeing him gripping the altar as if fighting against invisible forces, seeing his face contorted with the intensity of his spiritual combat. Some who witnessed these manifestations reported that they began to understand, for the first time, the true nature of what occurs at the altar, that the Mass is not merely a religious ceremony but a profound spiritual reality where the forces of good and evil are engaged in authentic combat. Yet what emerged from John Vianney's long endurance of these visions was not bitterness or despair but an increasingly radiant holiness. Despite, or perhaps because of, his constant awareness of demonic presence, John Vianney became known throughout the region as a priest of extraordinary sanctity. People traveled from great distances to receive his blessing, to be absolved by him in confession, to hear his words of spiritual wisdom. His face began to bear the marks of holiness, a radiance, a peace that transcended the trials he endured, a gentleness that could only come from a soul that had suffered deeply and had offered that suffering for the salvation of others. One of the most remarkable aspects of John Vianney's mystical experiences was his perception that the demonic assault at the altar did not diminish over time but actually intensified as his holiness deepened and as his ministry bore more fruit. He understood this paradox through his spiritual vision. The demons attacked him more fiercely precisely because his priesthood was more effective, because more souls were being converted through his intercession, because the grace flowing through his ministry was transforming the spiritual landscape of his parish. He wrote, "The intensity of their assault is proportional to the fruit being produced. Where there is no grace flowing, there is no demonic resistance. But where souls are being healed, where sinners are repenting, where faith is being restored, there the demons gather with greatest fury." This understanding liberated John Vianney from despair. The demonic presence at the altar became, paradoxically, a sign of his effectiveness as a priest, evidence that his ministry was bearing fruit, confirmation that souls were being saved through his intercession. Rather than weakening his faith, the visions strengthened it. Rather than driving him away from the priesthood, they deepened his commitment to it. And rather than isolating him in his suffering, his willingness to speak of his visions and his understanding of them began to transform the entire parish's understanding of what occurs at the altar. In the final years of his life, as John Vianney's body grew weak and he approached death, the intensity of his visions seems to have changed. Rather than focusing primarily on the demonic assault surrounding him, he began to perceive increasingly the supernatural protection surrounding the altar, the presence of angels, the intercession of saints, the protective hand of the Virgin Mary. Yet he never denied the reality of the demonic presence. Rather, he understood that both realities existed simultaneously. The demons were truly present and truly assaulting, but they were also truly defeated and truly powerless to prevent the grace of God from flowing through the Mass to transform souls. Saint John Vianney died in 1959, at an advanced age, his body consumed by his austerities and his spiritual labors. The Church recognized the extraordinary sanctity of his life and canonized him as a saint in 1925. In 1986, Pope John Paul II declared him the patron saint of priests, a recognition of his extraordinary understanding of what the priesthood truly is and what priests are called to endure and accomplish. His visions and his testimony about the demonic presence at the altar have become foundational to Catholic understanding of the spiritual reality that surrounds every celebration of the Eucharist. What emerges from the totality of John Vianney's documented mystical experiences is a vision of the priesthood and the Mass that is radically different from how many Catholics understand them. The Mass is not merely a religious ceremony or a devotional practice. It is the central battlefield in the cosmic war between good and evil. Every priest who approaches the altar is engaging in spiritual combat, standing on the front line of a warfare that determines the eternal fate of souls. The demons gather because they understand what many humans fail to understand, that the Mass is the most powerful thing that occurs on earth, that the Eucharist is the supreme expression of God's love and God's power, and that every soul transformed through the sacraments is a soul eternally beyond their reach. Moreover, what John Vianney perceived through his visions is that the priesthood is not a position of comfort or ease but a calling to endure spiritual assault, to stand firm despite the demonic rage surrounding the altar, to offer the Mass with perfect reverence and care even while under the most intense spiritual attack. The visions reveal that many priests are unaware of the demonic presence surrounding them because God mercifully veils their spiritual perception. But for those priests like John Vianney who are given the grace to perceive the spiritual reality, the calling becomes even more demanding, to know that demons surround them, to feel their assault, to hear their screaming, and yet to continue celebrating Mass with the same reverence, as if standing in the very presence of the saints and angels in heaven. Furthermore, John Vianney's visions reveal something crucial about the relationship between priestly holiness and demonic assault. The demons do not attack indiscriminately. They focus their assault on those priests whose ministry is most effective, whose holiness is greatest, whose intercession is obtaining the most grace for souls. In this way, the intensity of demonic presence becomes an indicator not of priestly weakness but of priestly strength, not of ministerial failure but of ministerial fruitfulness. The priest who perceives intense demonic assault can take it as evidence that his priesthood is achieving what priesthood is meant to achieve, the transformation of souls through grace. As you finish hearing about John Vianney's visions of the demonic presence at the altar, let the image remain with you that burned itself into his memory and transformed his entire understanding of priesthood. See him at the altar, his hands trembling as he raises the consecrated host, aware with overwhelming clarity of the demonic forces pressing against him from all sides, screaming their rage at his audacity in daring to offer the sacrifice of Christ. See him gripping the altar for support, his face pale from the intensity of the spiritual combat he is enduring, yet continuing to celebrate with perfect reverence because he understands that the eternal fate of souls depends on his faithfulness in that moment. Understand that every priest who stands at an altar is standing in that same place of cosmic significance, is engaging in that same spiritual warfare, is being assaulted by the same demonic forces that raged against John Vianney. The veil between the natural and supernatural world may be opaque for most people, but it is transparent in the presence of the Eucharist. The spiritual battle is real. The demons are real. And the victory of Christ over those demons is absolutely certain. When you next attend Mass, approach with the awareness that John Vianney's visions revealed. You are not merely attending a religious service. You are standing on holy ground where the cosmic battle between good and evil is being waged. You are witnessing the priest engaging in spiritual combat as he offers the sacrifice. You are participating in an event of such supernatural significance that all the forces of darkness gather in desperate opposition to prevent it. Your presence matters. Your faith matters. Your reverence matters. Because the demonic forces recognize what many humans fail to recognize, that the Mass is the most powerful thing occurring on earth, that the Eucharist is the very heart of God's redemptive work, and that every soul transformed through sincere participation in the Mass is a soul eternally beyond their reach. If John Vianney, a man of extraordinary holiness, a saint recognized by the entire Church as a model of priestly virtue, perceived the demonic presence surrounding the altar with such intensity, with such clarity, with such unrelenting assault throughout his entire priesthood, then what should be your understanding of what occurs at Mass? What reverence should you bring? What faith should you exercise? How should this knowledge transform your participation in the Eucharist? John Vianney's visions were not given to him alone. They were given to transform the entire Church's understanding of what the priesthood truly is and what occurs at the altar. His visions reveal a truth that many modern Catholics have forgotten or never understood, that the Mass is not a comfortable ritual to be observed casually, not a ceremony to be attended out of obligation, but the central mystery of our faith, the moment where heaven and earth intersect, where the cosmic battle between good and evil is waged, where the eternal fate of souls hangs in the balance. Tonight, as you reflect on these words about John Vianney's mystical encounters with the demonic presence at the altar, do not let the image fade from your awareness. Remember that John Vianney trembled at the altar not from weakness but from his acute perception of spiritual reality. His trembling was the response of a holy soul confronting the cosmic significance of what he was doing. His struggle was the struggle of a priest faithful to his calling despite overwhelming demonic opposition. And his victory, the fact that he continued to celebrate Mass with perfect reverence, that his ministry bore extraordinary fruit, that souls were transformed through his intercession, is evidence that Christ's power infinitely transcends demonic rage, that grace triumphs over evil, that the priesthood, though assaulted, is ultimately and eternally victorious. What will be your response? Will you approach Mass with the reverence John Vianney's visions demand? Will you recognize the spiritual reality surrounding the altar? Will you participate with faith, with sincere sorrow for sin, with genuine openness to being transformed by grace? The battle is real. The stakes are eternal. And your response, in this moment, determines everything.